My real theme for today, I think you can catch a glimpse of that in the notice board. My real theme of today is Jupiter. And Jupiter in the global orchestration directories, and there is no better name, no funnier name, no more amusing name for me than the global orchestration directories, which of course the acronym is gods, the gods. And we're going to take a look at the gods. We're actually going to take a look at the orchestration directory anyway. Jupiter. I guess if an astrologer looking at my astrology, because I have Jupiter on the ascendant in Sagittarius, they would talk about my Jupiterian nature, and there's no question that I am a great lover of Jupiter. The Jovian archive, Jovian being, by Jove, by Jupiter, Jupiter is quite incredible. It's been in the language as long as there's language. If you go into the Sanskrit, it's Ipiter, which eventually in the Greek became the, all of these variations that moved along in the languages. Jupiter has been called the Logos, and it has been called the Hierophant. And for me, it's very clear that the whole show, in a sense, of the way in which the incarnative process, the way in which this grand programming of consciousness and form takes place, all of this is ruled by Jupiter. And in that sense, Jupiter is indeed the king of the gods, if you will. I think it's very difficult sometimes to really grasp how much we are locked into what appears to be a consistent and enduring program. And one of the most interesting things that I'm going to share with you this semester is the breakdown of that program. And the breakdown of that program, because we're coming to the end of the round. And it's already in the works. As a matter of fact, as we will share tonight, it's been in the works since 1991. So I open up with our first plate for the night. And here you can see the labeling of this as the four corners. Oh, let me tell you a good story first, though. I like those opportunities in cosmology to tell some stories. There's a very strange place on the island, I'm speaking of Ibiza, that's called Pudes Yeo. And it's not a tourist place. It's rarely actually ever even noticed by tourists. And it's at the eastern end of the island. And basically there is a rock plateau, and that comes to a very abrupt cliff-like edge that plunges down into the Mediterranean. It's not a huge drop down. It may be no more than 15 meters. And down below, where the landmass meets the water, thousands of years ago, the Phoenicians began to build a port there. And what's left over with the sea erosion and the salt water and so forth and so on after all of these years is that on a clear day, when you look down from the plateau above, it looks like the exposed spinal columns of giant dinosaurs or sea serpents laid out in the sea. And at low tide, you can walk out onto them, and quite a distance into the sea, because they're actually quite high up. Even at high tide, they're just barely covered by the sea, but they do disappear in that sense. And it was a place that, I went to early on in my early years on the island, and it was a wonder place to go to. But one of my favorite spots was if you went out about 15 or 20 meters from the shore, walking on this kind of submerged spine, you actually got to a rock configuration that was very much like a seat or an armchair or a throne, or however you want to perceive all of that. And I had an absolutely incredible experience with Jupiter there. Yeah, I had been there by myself all one evening, and I don't know, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I had decided that I was going to wander out and sit in this chair and just stare at the sky. So I went out there and got into this sort of rock chair and sat myself down and just sort of looked out at the sky. And as I was looking out over the sea, and it probably was about an hour later, Jupiter at that time of the year was the summer, and at that time of the year Jupiter rises out of the eastern Mediterranean in the middle of the night. And so there I was, sitting in this incredible seat in the middle of the sea, and Jupiter rises up over the horizon. And it was the first time I understood its power in a way. As it was rising, it threw a beam of light. I mean, it is incredibly bright. And that beam of light touched the sea. I mean, you could see it touch the sea. Not only could you see it touch the sea, you could actually watch it moving across the sea as Jupiter rose in the sky. And I watched that in fascination until that beam of light literally was on my chest, sitting in that seat. It was an extraordinary meeting with this absolutely incredible force. I mean, Jupiter is really something. It's a failed star. It's a failed star. So there is a capacity in it. I mean, after all, Jupiter gives out more light than it receives. It puts out more energy than it receives. It actually produces a very, very minor stream of neutrinos that are very important because it impacts the way in which all of our programming operates. So here we're going to take a look at, within the context of our cosmology, we're going to take a look at the four corners. And when we're looking at the four corners, what we're really looking at is a physical configuration. I'm going to move the graphing for a moment. What we're looking at is a physical configuration. So in looking at this illustration, the first thing you'll notice that this graphic here, this is the center. And you can see around the center that here is the camel, and underneath it is the dog. So what we're looking at is a schematic of the fractal lines of the shattering of the crystal. And we're looking at the shattering of the crystal in that sense from the center outward. Now, obviously, we're not going very far. We're looking at the closest forces connected to it because these are all going to be instrumental. So when you're looking here at this square in the center, what you're really looking at is the three components that we talked about last time, the three components that are part of the process of our sun and the way in which we are directly imprinted. But then, as you move to these four corners, and you can see within the schematic, this nature of the corner, each of these corners represents a specific object. And those objects endowed with these particular crystals, those four objects, and what we're going to look at is, we're going to look at the key to that, which is going to be Jupiter, and we're going to look at the stars Sirius and Dubhe and Alcyone, that these four represent the four corners. Now I'll come back to this illustration because there's many fascinating things that are actually at work here. But I want to give you a sense of the diagram itself, because in the plates the diagrams aren't very easy or clear, and I want to make sure that you understand what this is. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the establishment of a very specific fractal setup, a fractal setup that ultimately you see in the quarters of the wheel. And each of those quarters has a domain name, and each of those domains belong to one of these four objects that are rulers in that sense of those quarters. But also we'll talk about that because there's some real oddities in the way in which this works. So I'll go back to the plate. And when we go back to the plate, we have here the four quarters. We have Jupiter, Sirius, Dubhe, and Alcyone. Now, let's just think about that for a moment and talk about these stars, because they are stars that have been in the consciousness of humanity as long as we have had written records, and I assume going back much further than that, as simply lore. The only one that is relatively new in the game is Sirius. I mean, Sirius is very unusual. Very, very unusual. And we will have in a couple of weeks my Sirius night, and no pun intended. And that's really quite a story. It's one of the best stories I can tell you. But anyway, what we're looking at is, to begin with, Dubhe and Alcyone are very, very important. You know, they represent a specific kind of yin and a specific kind of yang, but a yin and a yang that is, well, it's unusual. To begin with, Alcyone is the central star of what we call the Pleiades. The Pleiades is a kind of, it looks like a hive of light when you see it in a clear sky. You know, this bundle of stars. And Alcyone supposedly, in the mythology of the star, that Alcyone and these other stars that are part of this grouping are known mystically as the Seven Sisters. On the other side, we have Dubhe. Now, Dubhe is a star of the Great Bear, or the Germans call it the Wagen. The Great Bear, you know, has been, it's in the Bhagavad Gita, it's in the New Testament, it's in the Old Testament, it's in the Koran. You know, it's one of those things that is just there. And the tradition of Dubhe is that it is one of the seven brothers. So you've got these seven brothers and you have these seven sisters. The fact that it has been in the consciousness of humanity for as long as humanity has been able to, you know, create any kind of stored language is already, you know, it's already saying something about the potency, in that sense, of these forces in our lives and to our consciousness. Now, the third one is Sirius. Now, Sirius is very different. Sirius is very, very different. I mean, if you go back to the beginnings of the great Egyptian civilization, and you go back to the first building of the first of the monuments, the way in which the architects and cosmologists worked in that era is that everything was aligned to the star that is known as Draco, the dragon. And Draco today is at the beginning of Sagittarius. The fact is that it was the brightest star in the sky. It's still, by the way, a rather bright star. It was the brightest star in the sky. So the early alignments for the first generation of monuments that were built, this was all aligned to Draco. And then overnight, it all changed. I mean, overnight, it all changed. And it was a deeply mystical event for those that were attuned to the experience. In many ways, I consider it very similar to what happened with Sanduliak 1987A when it supernovaed and filled us all with its neutrino information. It was certainly a major event. And that event was that the star that we call Sirius, before the event, nobody with the naked eye could have possibly seen it. Nobody with the naked eye could have seen it. But at some point in living historical memory, there were human beings who actually saw it happen. That at some point Sirius attracted a companion. It's known as Sirius B. And this companion is a dark companion, which means that it is a highly dense or super dense collapsed star, probably a neutron star, and a neutron star that was the result of some cataclysmic explosion at some earlier date, and that neutron star traveling in space and being captured in that sense by the gravitational field of Sirius. And the first thing that that companion did when it got pulled into the orbit of Sirius is that it began to suck the energy from Sirius, pulling the light, if you will, from Sirius into its dark companion. There's a people in Africa, North Africa. They're called the Dogon. These are fascinating human beings. And it is part of their mythology to not only worship Sirius, but they actually knew there was a companion. I mean, they knew. They have drawings of it. They knew there was a companion. They were aware of the mechanics of that event. Something rather extraordinary. And of course this was in a very, very otherwise primitive culture, but they were, they knew something, and they had an extraordinary revelation. Okay, so let's put this in perspective. Everybody looks to Draco as the focus, the great light in the sky. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, overnight, boom, there it is. This incredible light. Sirius. I mean, when you look up in the sky and you see it, wow. I mean, it's so bright. And it's not naturally bright. It's bright because all of that light and energy is being pulled off it. After that, everything in the Egyptian culture was aligned to Sirius. Everything. The dog star. The dog star. And the dog star became the main star of the sky. So we have these, these three stars that have an extraordinary history in terms of, the development of humanity, and always present one way or another in that sense. And then, of course, the fourth component. And you can say, well, Jupiter is not a star, but as I said, it is not a star. It is of star stuff. It never had enough mass in that sense. I mentioned that in an earlier class that, the most common star configuration in the cosmos is binary star systems, one star going around another. And, Jupiter, yes, it's going around the sun, but it never reached the full status of a full-blown fusion environment in which, its gas mass was converted into extensive heat and light and all the things that go with being a star. However, it's almost like Jupiter for me is a kind of neither this nor that. I was going to say hermaphrodite, but it doesn't fit. But still, neither this nor that. It's a star, but it's not. It's a planet, but it's not. But then again, that's what makes it so unique. I mean, that's what makes it so special. It's an extraordinary thing. All right, so let's look at the play. The four corners are directly involved in Rave personality programming. First thing. So they're directly involved. So there is this, continuity in humanity's acknowledgement of these forces and the importance of them. I mean, there's still people running around today who think they are Syrians, who think they're from Dubhe, who think they're from Alcyone, who get messages from the Pleiades, whatever the case may be. This is something that has been going on for thousands of years. By the way, you can't get information directly from them, but I'll talk about that, but that's something else. Okay, so the four corners are directly involved in Rave personality programming. The corners incarnate regularly. Something to think about. I love the fact that the gods, in that sense, incarnate. They come into form here. And they come into form here regularly. At least one is in a body in every Rave century. So, what you have is this process of aligning to the actual environment itself, sampling the environment itself as an ongoing process of programming it. Now, when I'm talking about Rave personality programming, or even talking about, the orchestration of incarnation, this is really the level we're working with here. In other words, what we're talking about in terms of these four corners is that, in a sense, the fifth element, the illusion that arises out of that quantum between those four, the thing that's there in the space, if you will, this is all about orchestrating and organizing the incarnative process. And so they themselves, in that sense, incarnate. The number one corner will incarnate, number one, Sirius, will incarnate in Switzerland in 1991. Isn't that a nice thought? Now I'm going to, as I said, we will have, we will have a session where we will talk specifically about Sirius, because it is, after all, a way for us to understand something very important right now. The orchestration directory system is breaking down. I mean, it's breaking down. And the ability to tap into all of the information necessary for the smooth operation of the continuity of incarnation is breaking down. Many of you in participating in other courses of mine, particularly things having to do with 2027 and the theme of, the changing of our sexuality, the onset of infertility. Just about everybody looks at that as strictly from the biological aspect of it. In other words, that, if there's going to be a change in the solar plex and it's going to impact the way in which, for example, the 6th gate work, or the 59th gate, which is opposite the 55, there's going to be this biological impact. But I want you to think in much larger terms here, in cosmological terms, to understand something. If the host system that has maintained our incarnative process is breaking down, one of the things that starts breaking down is the ability to incarnate. In other words, the breaking down of the control mechanism for incarnation is in fact what's leading to ultimately the biological evidence of it on the planet, not the other way around. All of this is, the whole program is being run from the outside. So the number one corner, Sirius, that number one corner, it incarnated in Switzerland in 1991. And it's never going back. I mean, that's the other thing that's so interesting. And you see, it has incarnated, and for as long as it lives, there will be life on this planet. It's quite something to think about. And obviously it must be, residing in something that has a very long lifespan. And in fact it is. And somewhere in the hinterland of Switzerland, there is a sapling. It's quite getting big now. One would think it's 14 years old. Switzerland has remarkable yew trees. And the yew tree is, it has its own mythology and cosmology, deeply connected to Teutonic mythology. Yew trees can live thousands of years. I mean, thousands of years. The first corner, Sirius, in 1991, left Sirius, incarnated into what would become a yew tree, and is alive somewhere, living out that process somewhere in Switzerland. And when that tree dies, it all ends. Isn't that interesting? something to think about. I mean, there's a piece of mysticism that'll get you down to the bone. Hopefully it's in a very obscure, well off the beaten track place, and it gets to fulfill its process. I mean, my assumption is that it will live until what we technically see as the end of the round, and that means another 1,300 years. So one would presume that it has a long life in front of it, but it is the mechanism. It is the mechanism. See, the global orchestration directory is falling apart. And it's falling apart because one of the corners is missing and is not able to do its programming. And I will talk about in detail the consequences of that when we get to that section in the work. The four corners each function as centers. At the Rave level, it is they which establish the nature of the world. So, it's something to really understand about these four forces, and also to understand all these, these crazy mystical boo-boos who do think that they, connect to these forces. They're quite right in a way. Their consciousness, it's deep within our consciousness. We do have a recognition of them. They are there. But the whole nature of the world, this is the principle. This is the principle that guides it. These four forces. And you can see again, the nature of the world is the byproduct of those four forces at work. Well, what happens when one's gone? What happens when one's gone? I mean, that's the whole thing. That's quite something. Okay. So the four corners each function as centers. At the Rave level, it is they which establish the nature of the world. They manifest the archetype of the four. The three stars, Sirius, Dubhe, and Alcyone, do not program Raves directly. That's why I said that, it's nice to think of one's specific communication with these forces, but in fact, we cannot interpret their frequency. We're not intended nor designed to interpret that frequency. Though penetrated by the same stream, like all things, Rave personality crystals cannot translate the frequency. The information might get through, but the fact is that we cannot translate its actual meaning. We're not designed, in other words, we're the byproduct of the programming. We don't receive the programming directly. The frequency that is coming from, these four corners, this is a frequency that has to be stepped down along the fractal line. And I want you to really understand something about fractals. It's like broken telephone. The further you go down the line, the less coherent everything becomes. The way in which the information that is coming out of these sources, this information, we're simply not capable of dealing with that. We're not close enough in that sense on that fractal. The reality is that first that whole thing, that whole information process has to be stepped down and translated through its movement in the fractal. So here, when it moves in the fractal, we begin to see that there is a dynamic here, a kind of, mirroring dynamic. That is, the three operate through Jupiter, which then translates the frequency to its four giant moons. So Jupiter is the only thing that is able to translate these frequencies directly. And it adds these three to its information, and then it moves its information and the other information out. But Jupiter's the medium. The great Yang Logos. This is the medium. So the giant moons of Jupiter are the key instruments of Rave personality consciousness. Each moon is a microcosmic representative of the four corners. Each moon. So what we're going to be looking at is that when we move over to this graphic, And you can see in looking at this graphic that, if we're looking at, for example, Sirius, then its information is translated by Io. If we're looking at Dubhe, its information is translated by Ganymede. If we're looking at Alcyone, the information is going to go through Europa. If we're looking at Jupiter, it is Callisto. So here we're looking at, this basic structure of the way in which the information in that sense is going to move. Now, how does this work? Think about Jupiter and its relationship with these moons. And again, I'll go back a step and a half there for you. Here are these moons. And the whole thing to understand about the moons of Jupiter is to understand something about Jupiter. Jupiter puts out an absolutely extraordinary magnetic field. I mean, it's an extraordinary magnetic field. And these moons are within this magnetic field. And the thing to try to grasp is that it is not so much the objects themselves, but the magnetic field that they operate in that is the place where all the information is stored and all of the programming is initiated. It's something to grasp. It's in the magnetic field. So these objects, the way the information translated by Jupiter from the 3 stars, the way this information then goes out, it goes out through Jupiter's magnetic field. And this magnetic field, within the field itself, is all the stored information. One of the first things that I can clearly remember from the voice was that it was important to pay attention because the information was disappearing. It wasn't said that way, but that's basically what it was about. In other words, it's like the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. It would be like somebody burning the Akasha records. But this is more. Those are just, minor things compared to what it means when this magnetic field is not carrying all of the information that it needs to maintain the program. And that the fact that the magnetic field itself is beginning to break down. In other words, it's not operating correctly. Now, that's why, for example, that if you extrapolate that back down to us, what you get is understanding that the whole mutation we've been talking about, all of this 2027 and all the stuff in the solar plex center and all of this, it's all a byproduct of a much larger process of, I don't want to call it deterioration or breakdown because it's all part of a program. But what it does mean is that the whole incarnative process is breaking down. There will be no reincarnative cycle to follow. I mean, when we get to the end of this round has been determined by the reincarnative experiment. In other words, the constant testing of the same personality crystals through endless variations of vehicles to see whether or not, the expression of consciousness in form is viable and how viable it can be. Now again, I state it in that way as if somebody is testing. Nobody's testing, it's what's happening. It's just what's happening. And we are designed to come to the end of the reincarnative process. The Aeron, the design of the form that will follow, and long after the end of this round, long after, but nonetheless, that form will not have a reincarnative process. So, one of the things to understand about reincarnation is how complex it is. It's very complex. You got to keep records. It's very, very complex. And it takes an enormous amount of organization and resources to maintain the global orchestration directories. The gods, in that sense, are dying. The whole construct is beginning to fall apart. The effort in that sense, the ability to be able to maintain the reincarnative program, all of this is beginning to collapse. And it's beginning to collapse because the first corner, and it's not called the first corner for nothing, that the first corner is no longer playing its part. That center crystal that resided in Sirius, that was there when, the Dark Companion came and Sirius took on its enormous role in our consciousness, it's not there anymore. And it's never going back. It just isn't. There is no Sirius. It reminds me of that wonderful, wonderful line in the Matrix movie. There's this little boy in this scene trying to audition for being a savior, and he can bend spoons. And he's asked how he does it, and he says, well, there is no spoon. There is no spoon. There is no Sirius. See, when you look at the sky, you're looking at the past. You're only looking at the past. And slowly but surely the past will catch up to the future somewhere down the line. But Sirius is not there. Sirius is in Switzerland. That star that shone so brightly is dead. What's out there is its remnants and the overwhelming last gasps as the Dark Companion strips away the last of its life. That's not there. So it means we're not being programmed properly anymore. The 4 has been reduced. There is something that's been taken away. And of course it doesn't just go away. It is a deteriorating phenomena. In other words, it is a slow process. By the way, at cosmic levels of time, it's very, very, very fast. That was 1991. It's very, very fast. But in terms of our time, at the end of this round, who's ever there, looking up at the sky, somebody's going to turn out that light. It's already off. We just don't know that. So there is this process of, as the light is still coming to us, there are still remnants of the information in the neutrino field that is pouring to us. The neutrino field that was released in, right up until 1991, and we're still taking that information in. So it's not like there is this instantaneous breakdown. It's breaking down slowly. By the way I assume, in the greater dynamics of things, that it was intended to break down. But the thing that's so extraordinary for me is this role of Jupiter right here in the middle of all of that. This is the heart and soul of the whole incarnative process. Now, if you know mythology, particularly if you know Greco-Roman mythology, there is something very unusual about Jupiter. And the thing that's so unusual about Jupiter is that Jupiter's stories are all about Jupiter incarnating. Jupiter's always incarnating. Now, most of the time, Jupiter is a sort of low-level rapist when you look at the way in which some of these myths are described, because so often his taking form was an act of trying to seduce some mortal female or whatever. However, aside from all of that, the thing that's so fascinating about Jupiter is that you won't find a god that has incarnated as much historically. In other words, this whole theme here of what this is all about. It is about incarnating, but it's more than that. It's about reincarnating constantly. This turning over and over, this global orchestration directory. And orchestration because you have to bring certain forces in, take certain forces out. There are mechanisms in all of this. And all of it, you can find its source in Jupiter. And, this truly is the Logos. This is really, this is the king of the gods. It's as much a god as anything that any human could possibly imagine, because if they really understood what Jupiter does, it is godlike. I mean, when you look up and you wonder why did God make me this way? It's Jupiter. It's Jupiter. Why was I born in these horrible times? It's Jupiter. Why did I have to come back? It's Jupiter. Why do I have to go? It's Jupiter. If you go into the core of any of the planetary mythologies and you understand what Jupiter does within this context, this is God. I mean, this is God. Hello, God. This is about as close as you can come to a description of the so-called monotheistic God. Whether that's Yahweh or Allah or, whatever choice that you want to make in all of that. This is what God was supposed to do. Control the nature of the world, bring us in, bring us out, all of this stuff. That's Jupiter. And Jupiter is just, a very grand pawn in a very grand game. I mean, I appreciate it very much, but then again, I refer to the gods as gods because I like to. I also understand mechanically what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a very sophisticated personality crystal, and a very sophisticated personality crystal that doesn't have the burden of living in a human body, that operates through another kind of form principle that is not possible for me to grasp. And I can understand that, the way in which these centers operate as forces, I can understand that this is the mechanism. It's just a mechanism. I don't have to glorify them as the gods, but then again, they are. I mean, they are. That's what's so fascinating about it. And you see, they're mortal. I mean, they're not immortal. They're mortal. Sometimes their lifespans are enormous. And so there is this sense of endlessness to it. But they're mortal. I mean, Sirius is at the end of its rope. It's going down the tubes. They die. Our star will die. The sun will die. It's all part of the way things operate. And for me, the manager of this round, the manager of the last, 16,000 years, whatever you want to call it, the manager is Jupiter. This is really the boss. All hail Zeus. It's so clear to me. This is what it's all about. And it's out of this force, that the law of reincarnation is maintained. And just is. And of course, the thing about Jupiter is that Jupiter has to find a way to compensate for the diminishment of the power of the first corner. And it can't. It can't. So it is losing its own equilibrium in trying to balance everything. And you can see in this illustration how much Jupiter has to act as a balancing agent between these forces. Between this high frequency neutrino input and the way in which this is then stepped down, within the magnetic field, so that these four objects, can then actually do the work, because they're the ones, in that sense, who are really doing the actual work of fulfilling the programming. And of course there's going to be dilemmas there, because these are relationships that are very, very specific. In other words, there are special alignments, fractal lines, that are there in that sense between the stellar object and lunar object. So, if you go to here, you can see that, these relationships are very specific. So what happens in that sense to, and I'm sorry I said Callisto, what happens to Io in that sense when it's not able to receive what is its essential information from Sirius? And it's very, very difficult then to get that information across. And you can see here in this illustration what it means in that sense, that there is this fractal step down that is going out. It's simply something that is just, it's going out along these fractal lines. Now, graphically, it's the best way that, that I can illustrate that to you. So, where there is a clean line between Dubhe and Ganymede, where there's this clean line in the others, here we have a dilemma because Sirius is not, Sirius is deteriorating. And that deterioration, is not something that's going to be fully noticeable, probably for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's already having its impact. And there is already the beginnings of, that collapse or that breakdown in the way in which the actual control mechanism for the reincarnative process works. There are many oddities about that I sort of could see. I mean, I talk about my experience. Because they're very strange things, crystals that not only cannot incarnate, but crystals that cannot get back anywhere. There's a lot of things that are happening in that sense, in terms of what is the result of this information breaking down. The other thing is that if you look at all the yin-yang configurations, if you look at all yin-yang configurations, anywhere that you see them, then you're also seeing something that in many ways is beginning to deteriorate. So there are a lot of things that are going on at the larger level that when we see it here on Earth and when we see it microcosmically, we end up seeing the biological results of it. We end up looking at it in terms of what its impact is going to be on the surface of the way in which our illusion operates. And I can talk about, the weakening of the human immune system, the weakening of the fertility system, all of these things. But in fact, all of this goes back to the larger program itself breaking down. Before I go to my break, one thing to really think about, and it's just as a mystical thing. It's going to be more and more difficult for any kind of revelation to work. It's going to be more and more difficult for information that traditionally is always moving from the outside to humanity and back, that many lines of information are literally closing down. So there is a process of deterioration that's taking place that is two things. One, the deterioration opens up the potential for the final mutation, that is the solar plex mutation. The other thing is that the deterioration is simply the end game, if you will, for the reincarnative process, which of course means the end game for the life process on this planet. Quite a thing to think about. Okay, let's get into some interesting corners here. By the way, Spiradulos, in terms of your question, whether the corners incarnate as human, they can incarnate as anything. Generally speaking, it is not human. However, I was told that, I wasn't given any kind of official number, but the impression that I was given was that it was probably Maybe 25% of the time, maybe less, but somewhere in that neighborhood. Most of the time it's other forms. Even if you look into the mythology, and there is some extraordinary validity to a lot of the kind of wilder things. The idea of gods, Jupiter, for example, incarnating as a swan or a goat or whatever the case may be. I tend to think that's more likely. Remember that they are, if we can speak of it that way, their job requires them to reincarnate. In other words, to go in and out, and ultimately to go back in again. It's part of understanding, I guess, in one way or another, or keeping alignment to what the general process is. I honestly, because, maybe the longer I talk about it, there's stuff inside of me that I don't even know I know about it, but at this particular point, I have real lack of understanding as to what they would experience here. For example, I think it was Jagrudi's question about whether or not the programming is still possible. The fact that Sirius is not in Sirius. No, it's not possible. Remember something about the nature of personality crystals that's so incredible. A personality crystal is limited by the vehicle that it belongs to. My joke about what's the difference between a man and a dog. Well, there's no difference. They're the same. A dog is a dog and a man is a man. And the only difference, in fact, are their design crystals. It has nothing to do with anything. We both have the same quality personality crystal, or at least the same potential. The fact that these particular crystals are first fractals from the center obviously represents a certain level of how shall we call this, a certain level of clarity, but also at the same time a very limited clarity. Remember, if you look at this illustration, you can really understand what I mean about the dilemma of the first corner breaking down, is that to understand that the information of the center, just as an example now, the information of the center, what's going to happen is that there's going to be this aspect of it, which is only one of four aspects of it. There's going to be this aspect, so forth and so on. In other words, each of these are representing a specific limitation. Yin, yin, yang, yang. It's a specific limitation. So it's very important to see that the moment you take away one of these, and the moment you take this crystal out of what it is to be in a star, for example, the incarnation or the reincarnating of Sirius into a form on this planet, from the moment it does that, it stops being able to manipulate as a crystal, filter as a crystal, the information that it could when it was in the form that we call star. The fact that it enters into the form of something else, that it enters into the form of a tree or a seed, that the reality is that it is then limited by that function, and it is not going to be able to carry on its functions. The interesting thing about, why the gods, quote unquote, would choose to come into the forms of lower animals is that it protects them from the risk of being stuck too long. They don't like being stuck too long. So, these things they're really curious. But again, one of the basic laws of crystals of consciousness is that they are limited by the form that they operate out of. So no, Sirius does not program anymore. As I said, when we look at the sky, we look at the past. So we're still receiving programming that was originated through the filtering of the crystal of Sirius, but that's very different. Anyway, okay. Now we have to deal with something that is, it's very tricky. It can be very confusing, and I don't want you to get confused by this. If you look at this drawing, this illustration, and you were to tilt it this way, to the left, 45 degrees, you would have exactly the yin-yin here, where in the wheel you would have the second gate, which is yin-yin. And then you go across over here and you would have the yang-yang. In other words, with this tilt. And they're in exactly the right positions. But this and this are reversed. They're reversed. They're different from the way in which they're exactly opposite the way in which it operates in the wheel. They're exactly opposite. Now, it is this very dynamic. This is kind of like, matter-antimatter kind of thing. This is exactly what makes the whole thing work. And one of the problems with this is that everything was fine as long as they were both there. But this isn't there anymore. This is something that is breaking down. And so the whole way in which the mechanism, it's almost as if it gets, I'm raising my hand as if you could see me, as if it gets twisted because of this shifting here. They're in different places. This chop should be up here, and this chop should be down here. But they're not. And from the moment that that was laid out for me, and that was laid out for me at the same time that I was given the names of the quarters. And of course it was an initial confusion. In other words, you got this is the name, the quarter of Sirius, for example, but the chop's all wrong. But how it works here on the outside is very different than the way it works within the context of the wheel. And this oppositeness, this reversed aspect is absolutely essential in order to make the whole process work. Without this, you do not have the incarnative process. Now, mystically, if you study quarters, this quarter of form and civilization, and this quarter of, having to get ready to go through the process of leaving to return, the value of the process itself, that all of this is the byproduct of this polarity, or this reversal. But there's a real dilemma. You see, as the old information arriving from Sirius begins to peter out, then the whole mechanism of the way in which the incarnative process works breaks down. And this is what it's all about. We are dealing with the ending of something. Now, there are many points of view, many perspectives that this brings me to whenever I have to look at this subject, because there's so many fascinating things to think about. For example, and I will show you all this, I have the layout of the hexagram structure for the Aeron period, and it doesn't look anything like this. In other words, it doesn't even operate out of a 4 anymore. This is something that is all breaking down. But where I have real fascination is in this couplet. Right? This couplet here, this yin-yang couplet. I mean, think about the places where this appears in all of the various hexagrams. Not just simply the quarter that it is connected to. And of course, this is connected to what is its opposite in terms of looking at the wheel. So it's going to be connected to the whole civilization quarter. And what you're looking at with this, with this yin-yang, pardon me, I keep on saying civilization. This is the duality quarter. That this whole thing is breaking down, and that the amino acids, or the components that these represent, that these are the components that are deteriorating throughout our chemistry, or throughout our biology. I mean, think about that. I mean, that to me is the most fascinating thing. In other words, when you look at this configuration here, the yin below and the yang above, this binary, not looking at trinaries anymore, just looking at the basic triplets that are always there in the way in which a codon or a hexagram are structured. These 3 of 2. And to see that this component here is deteriorating. It's deteriorating so that the final construct can emerge. In other words, this is something that has to go. And what's really deteriorating the fastest is this top yang line. There is a difference, by the way, in these two variations. I mean, within, the singularity within the binary here. But it's something to really understand that every single codon that carries this yin-yang as an ingredient, that there is deterioration taking place in the way in which it puts out information. Because everything that we're looking at here is about dispensing information. The whole thing is an information system. All of it. And to really recognize something about what Jupiter is doing with its tiny little magnetic, not magnetic, with its tiny neutrino stream that it produces, is that here's Jupiter taking in the information, translating the information, stepping it down in frequency. Remember, that's Jupiter's advantage of not quite being what they are, and not quite being what they are. This middle ground that Jupiter always sits in, that it takes this information, it steps down the frequency, and it puts that frequency out as neutrino information that filters through these moons. Now think about it, what that means in terms of the way we look at transits. See, when I look at the transit of Jupiter, I'm looking at the transit of the Global Orchestration Directory. I mean, I'm looking at the Jupiterian field. Think about what's really programming us. Not only the background neutrino field, but the specific neutrino stream that is created by Jupiter, that goes through its moons, that the moons filter it through their specific limited capacity, and it is through that filtering that all of that information comes to us. And it comes to us through the agency of Jupiter. I mean, think about your birth chart. If I'm talking about the mundane level, I'm always talking about Jupiter and the law. Jupiter sets the rules, blah, blah, blah. But I want you to understand that the moment that you have a Jupiter imprint, period, you are imprinted with not only being a part of the reincarnative process, but you're being specifically controlled in that process, measured in that process, timed in that process. In other words, you're part of the larger orchestration mechanism. And all of that is the agency of Jupiter. And the transiting Jupiter, where the transiting Jupiter of, pre-1991 carried with it a complete spectrum of information to maintain the whole programming validity of the reincarnative construct, that since 1991, that is not the case. It really isn't the case. I think it was in, I'm not certain now, but it was certainly somewhere early in the 90s that, Jupiter was struck by this comet. There was these incredible photographs at the time of, this kind of Jupiter's magnetic and gravitational field shattered this comet into, I think, 22 or 23 parts, each of them like glowing jewels on a necklace, and it all smacked into Jupiter. And I remember the astrophysical analysis of that event, because there were many people who thought it was going to be the end of the world and blah, 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 and all of that. It had an enormous impact, at least on the surface of the way in which Jupiter's magnetic field operated. But there was something else that was interesting. What was interesting was that one of the scientists said that if you could get close, 1994 July, thank you, Linda, if you could get close enough to Jupiter, and you were actually allowed, in a sense, to be able to smell that event, it would have smelled like dead fish. And I thought that was an extraordinary description, because you see, this is a marker ending an age. It's really ending an age. And, this is a process where, the deterioration's built in. I mean, I have the feeling that this is the way rounds die, if you know what I mean. I mean, there is a mechanism to come in, there is a mechanism to be, and there is a mechanism to go out. It's all there, And it's all there because it's all there at every single level that we can imagine that, the biverse operates at. And we are looking at the death of, this process, the death of this reincarnative life process. It's actually quite primitive, if you think about it. Basically what it means, remember, all personality crystals are fundamentally equal in their uniqueness, if that makes any sense to you. In other words, they all have the potential, given the specific form, to be able to experience, as we do, self-reflected consciousness. But obviously they don't all have these vehicles. And the reason that we have been going through this round of the reincarnative process is that this is not about the personality crystals. It's about the form. It's about perfecting the form. It's only when the form is perfected, it's only then that the real potential of personality consciousness can finally come out. So, we're dealing with a round in which everything about this round has been going through this constant in and out in order for personality crystals, same ones, over and over again, in some cases hundreds of times, experiencing the different levels of form development. All of this is a form process. And from the outside, if you can imagine what has happened to Sirius, then you can see that there is a larger form principle that is beginning to collapse. And it's not bad. And it's not because something wrong happened, and it is simply this is the larger life, and the larger life beginning to deteriorate. And in that larger deterioration, at our local level, lies all the potential for the mutative wonder that can come into the world, with this whole new mutation that's going to emerge. But we've got a closing window on all of this. Another 1,300 years for us, yeah, sure, it seems like, okay, if we think back to 700 AD, it seems like a long time ago, but that's being human. But in terms of the way in which the cosmos works, the death of this order is imminent. I mean, it's imminent. It is just hanging over there. This is a deathbed scene in many ways. Just in cosmic timing. So the very thing that is bringing this deterioration, I mean, the whole potential for the true mutation and the transformation of the genetic process in terms of the solar plex, all of this was initiated way above us in a realm that we don't have anything to do with. And if you ever want to look for the Godhead, well, this is your image. This is Ra Uruhu's image of the Godhead, and this is what the Godhead looks like. And the whole thing about it is that, we've got a problem. I mean, we have a problem. And I don't mean it to be that it's a problem that is, again, bad, needs to be fixed. I only use that language because it's different. Let's call it that. It's a mutation, after all. I mean, it's a mutation in the larger level. Now, the mutation itself may bring about deterioration, but in fact, it's this mutation that opens up the next level and the next level and the next level of mutation. Where there is really a dilemma is in the frequency of Jupiter. Because you see, it's Jupiter's frequency that is controlling the whole mechanism. And this is the real dilemma. And in my own tracking of things, one of the things that I'm fascinated with is tracking Jupiter now, and Jupiter in its relationship to Pluto, because there's something very important about this relationship at this time. And for me, it's clear that there is this enormous destabilization that is taking place, and that part of my even doing this or even entering into this whole rave cosmology process is that I seem to be the only one who knows all this stuff. And if I don't share it and put it out there, it really will be lost. This is a closing of doors. And the most interesting thing is to think about it in terms of the fact that we are living in a first line period in our present cycle. We entered into the first line at the beginning of the 1960s, and we're going to end in 2027 by going into the sixth line theme. I mean, remember, always we're going backwards. We're going through the precession of the equinox. And the moment when we entered into this first line theme, if you look at it in terms of, global cycle mapping, in terms of locks and keys, you will see that this is a 61-1 era. In other words, that inner truth, both occult and exoteric, is only possible in this era, only now. This is the era of the tree and all the fruit are available, but you still have to manage to get to them, to eat them. And this door is going to close, and I've talked about that. I've talked about the age of innovation coming to an end. This closing of the investigative, collective, tribal, cooperative investigation into the nature of being. All of this is coming to an end. The inspirations about all of this are coming to the end. All of it. And all of that is that this number one corner, is no longer functioning. And is no longer functioning properly. There is still the leftover stream, but even that in and of itself is not rooted anymore. It's not part of what is in fact a true continuity. So, as we move towards 2027, this is the time to know. I guarantee you that, the generation that is born in 2026, when that generation dies, you will have lost the true inspiration that has guided our process. It'll simply be over. Revelation and those kinds of things will have come to an end. There will be no answers available if the answers are not found now or shared now. And between now and 2027, this is really a closing of that door. So there are things that are disappearing. And there are things that are no longer going to be made available to human consciousness. And we are in a great time of change. It's a great time of change. It's wonderful to be alive and aware and recognize the mechanics of things and to really see this at work. I mean, after all, the voice told me that this is my last roundup, so I will go on the presumption that it's probably accurate. And I look out with my eyes and I can see where it's all going. And I can see how incredible it is. I mean, it's just incredible to see this huge, vast, beautiful, it's so aesthetic, this gorgeous organizing of the whole process. And to see clearly that reincarnation coming to an end is, if I can use that language, a great victory for consciousness. I mean, to get to that point is something that's very, very important for us, because it opens up the platform for receiving the personality of the totality and opens up the final stage of the development of the whole. So this path of experimentation, the suffering that humanity, that all of us who are, always to remember that if you are in incarnation, you have always been an incarnating force. And it means that all of the pain and suffering of going in and out and not remembering and going in and out and not remembering and on and on and on, that all of that, to serve a greater purpose, to serve the greater purpose of, the potential of a form that truly can house a consciousness that we ourselves are not even capable of glimpsing. And it seems, if you follow the program, that we're on track to fulfilling that potential. And all of that is related to the number one corner disappearing. Interesting stuff. Anyway, I take my break and I'll answer your questions if I can.